16th century England, a confluence of social, economic, and political factors led to widespread poverty, prompting the introduction of the English Poor Laws. These laws, implemented over several centuries, were intended to provide relief to the poor, particularly in times of economic hardship. However, the laws also had a darker side, as they institutionalized poverty by forcing the destitute into workhouses, where conditions were often harsh and inhumane. Before the Poor Laws, charity in England was largely the domain of the church and the monasteries, which provided alms, shelter, and care to the needy. However, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 1530s dismantled this system, removing one of the primary sources of relief for the poor. Coupled with the increasing pressures of urbanization, population growth, and economic transitions, such as the enclosure of common lands, which displaced peasants from rural areas, poverty became a significant social problem. Vagrancy and homelessness became widespread as agricultural workers were displaced and unable to find stable employment. As these people moved to towns and cities in search of work, they often found themselves labeled as criminals, vagrants, or idlers. This led to the passing of a series of laws aimed at controlling the poor, initially more focused on punishment than welfare. In response to the growing crisis, the government introduced the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, a landmark piece of legislation that formalized the responsibility of the state to care for its impoverished citizens. This law established a system of local poor relief that would serve as the foundation of England's welfare policy for over 2 centuries. The law made the parish, the smallest unit of local government, responsible for the relief of the poor within its borders. Each parish was required to collect a poor rate, a local tax used to fund welfare for those in need. This tax would support the deserving poor, those who were genuinely unable to work due to old age, disability, or illness. The undeserving poor, those seen as able-bodied but idle, were dealt with more harshly, often being forced into labor or punished for vagrancy. Outdoor relief. This was provided to the deserving poor, typically in the form of food, money, or other necessities, allowing them to remain in their homes while receiving support. Indoor relief. The undeserving poor, those able to work but unemployed, were often sent to workhouses or almshouses, where they were required to labor in exchange for food and shelter. This system marked the beginning of the institutionalization of poverty in England. Workhouses were at the heart of the English poor law system. Originally, they were seen as a way to provide employment for the able-bodied poor, while also discouraging idleness and dependence on charity. However, over time, the workhouse system became infamous for its brutal and dehumanizing conditions. Workhouses operated on the principle of less eligibility, a term introduced by the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. This principle dictated that life in the workhouse should be worse than the life of the poorest laborer outside it, to ensure that only the truly desperate would seek assistance. In theory, this was meant to incentivize people to find work outside the system, but in practice it often condemned the poor to horrific conditions. Life inside a workhouse was grueling. Upon entry, families were separated. Husbands, wives, and children were all housed in different wards and forbidden to see each other. The work assigned to inmates was often monotonous and degrading. For men, this might include breaking stones, grinding corn, or picking oakum, unraveling old ropes for use in shipbuilding. Women were often tasked with laundry, cleaning, or sewing. The elderly or infirm, who were unable to work, were confined to wards where conditions were frequently unsanitary and overcrowded. The food provided in workhouses was basic and barely sufficient to sustain life. Meals often consisted of thin gruel, bread, and occasionally a small amount of meat or vegetables. Inmates lived under a strict regime, with little personal freedom. Any breach of the strict rules, such as talking without permission or disobeying orders, was met with harsh punishment. The once stigma attached to entering a workhouse was severe. Poverty was often viewed as a moral failing, and those who sought relief in workhouses were seen as lazy or immoral. As a result, many people tried to avoid the workhouse at all costs, even if it meant enduring extreme poverty outside its walls. The most significant change to the poor law system came with the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which sought to overhaul the existing system and reduce the cost of poor relief. This act centralized the administration of poor relief by establishing poor law unions, which grouped several parishes together under the supervision of a board of guardians. The 1834 law reinforced the workhouse system, stating that all relief for the able-bodied poor should be provided within workhouses. This was a drastic shift from the earlier system of outdoor relief, which allowed the poor to receive assistance without entering an institution. By making the workhouse the only option, the government aimed to reduce the number of people claiming poor relief by making it an unattractive prospect. While the new system did succeed in reducing costs and curbing outdoor relief, it also led to increased suffering for the poor. Workhouse conditions became even more oppressive, and the separation of families, inadequate food, and harsh labor remained the norm. The workhouse became a symbol of the state's indifference to the plight of the poor. The workhouse system, though intended as a deterrent to idleness, soon came under fire from critics. Reformers, social activists, and writers like Charles Dickens brought attention to the inhumanity of the system. Dickens' novel, Oliver Twist, famously depicted the horrors of the workhouse, highlighting the cruelty of a system that punished the poor for their poverty. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, attitudes towards poverty began to shift. Social reformers advocated for better treatment of the poor, and gradually, the workhouse system was reformed. In 1909, the Royal Commission on the Poor Laws recommended significant changes to the system, and by the early 20th century, many workhouses were closed or converted into hospitals or care homes for the elderly. The once poor law system was officially abolished in 1948 with the creation of the parish-based National Health Service and the establishment of a modern welfare state. This marked the end of the workhouse era and the beginning of a more compassionate approach to poverty and social welfare in England. The English Poor Laws were among the first attempts by a European state to address poverty on a national scale. While the system did provide a framework for welfare, it also institutionalized poverty in a way that inflicted great suffering on the poor. The legacy of the Poor Laws can still be seen in modern welfare systems, which continue to grapple with the balance between providing relief and discouraging dependency. The workhouses, in particular, have become a symbol of the cruelty that can result when poverty is treated as a moral failing rather than a social issue. Though the Poor Laws were eventually replaced by more humane forms of welfare, their history serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of punitive approaches to poverty relief.